RCR Wireless News, I'm Sean Kinney, and we're here at the 5G New Horizons Wireless Symposium in Austin, Texas, to speak with Mr. Colin Willcock, who is the chairman of the board of the 5G Infrastructure Association. So Colin, thank you so much for taking a moment to speak with us. First off, for our viewers who are not familiar, can you explain the work that the 5G-IA does?
Yes, by all means. So the 5G-IA is an industry association which represents 5G industry in Europe. So one of the key things we do is in the research program, the 5G PPP, which you may have heard of, which has done a lot of the fundamental research in 5G, which has led to the standard there. The private side, so the industry is represented by ourselves, and then the public side, the funding agency is then by the European Commission. So that's one of the key things we do. But beyond that representation of industry in that research program, we have a series of activities trying to publicize about 5G, trying to get a common position for European industry on things like spectrum, trying to publicize and document things like the 5G activities going on in Europe, the trials and all the things going on there. And there it's a very colourful and very broad landscape. So in other parts of the world we see perhaps the first systems being deployed earlier, but those systems are typically concentrating more on the massive broadband, whereas in Europe what we see is maybe not so much first deployment now, but a very broad range of trials of first 5G systems, not for service, but to try out a lot of these important ideas with the vertical industries, which will actually be the test of whether 5G is successful or not.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you raise. A lot of the early implementations that we're expecting in the US are based on this non-standalone 5G NR variant, are very much geared towards delivering an enhanced mobile broadband experience. But that's just one part of 5G. So I was hoping you could maybe expand a little bit on the other two major 5G use cases, massive IoT and the ultra-low latency reliable communications, and why that is very keenly important for these vertical industries.
Yeah, firstly maybe to say why a vertical industry is important, because obviously when people think of telecoms, the first thing they think of is their smartphone, and they're saying, well, why do I need anything else rather than just more and more data? But the point is the actual revenue, the amount of money that can be created in that classical telecoms world of a user, an operator and a vendor, that is somewhat limited. People don't wish to pay more, which I can understand. I don't wish to pay more. But if we're really going to get these all-encompassing networks, 5G networks, we need other sources of revenues. We need some other business model, but we also need to bring in some other industries. And this is where the verticals come in, things like automotive, like healthcare, like media, where we have the potential for revolutionizing those businesses in their own right, but in doing that also creating value for both sides, for the vertical industries, but also for the telecoms industries. And if you look at what they need as requirements, it's obviously different to someone with their mobile phone. So data rate is always important, or shall we say at least the efficiency of using the air interface, which is always a very limited quantity. You only have so much spectrum which you can use. But beyond that, what's often very important is things like robustness and reliability and latency. If I am in a car which is going 200 kilometers an hour, so we're in the US, if we're going 120 miles an hour, which you typically don't do in this country, but you would get arrested, but you wouldn't in Germany where I live. And if the car is driving itself, and if around the corner on the motorway or the Autobahn there is an accident, and the 5G system is being used to make sure that there is no that my car doesn't get involved in that accident, then at that point the robustness of that connection, the fact that my car does get that message, and the fact that my car does get that message with enough time to slow down so that it doesn't hit the accident around the corner, that then becomes life critical. And this is, for me, the promise of 5G. It's not just about YouTube on your mobile phone. It's about having an integrated series of networks which bring the promise of automated driving, of smart cities, of remote telemedicine, of things like this. And for a lot of these areas, we need that robustness. They are safety critical. We're seeing more and more things about security risks with data on Facebook, or people hacking into various things and closing down, whether that's uranium enriching or power systems, or all these networks are becoming more and more digital, but that also means that they're becoming more and more critical. And the ability to actually bring down those networks, or the ability not to have a robust network, becomes more and more important for everyday life. So when we're talking about latency, that side is not just about shortness of time, though that is very important. Obviously, if you're doing a remote operation, you need that latency reaction so that you can actually control the operation. That would be an obvious situation where that's very important. There's a whole class of problems where that's important. Automated driving, I've talked about, where latency is important. But there's a whole class of problems. Even when we're talking about interaction with users, when we get to tactile feedback, this again is sort of millisecond accuracy, where we can do exciting things if we have that ability. So that's the latency robustness corner. We then have the massive IoT, so the ability not to deal with millions but billions of devices. And we can see already in our world that more and more things are becoming digital, whether it's your fridge, whether it's your lawnmower outside. Everything is being connected into this smart network. And we're seeing now a lot of logistical solutions where they say, look, we have a ubiquitous logistics solution that means you can track anything, whether that's a truck or your child or your dog or a can of baked beans. All we can use with one logistical system. But if you imagine how many cans of baked beans there are, for example, that's an awful lot of things where I've got some sort of tags. And the network needs to be able to handle that. It needs to be able to handle that number of entities. And this is going then in the direction of IoT, Internet of Things, where everything is connected into that network. And there we need massively more abilities, functionality with the network to handle this tenfold or hundredfold or thousandfold increase in entities.
So more on this latency point, if you're going for applications that require, let's say, sub 5 millisecond responsiveness from the network, this means that to a certain extent you need to distribute more infrastructure throughout. You could multi-edge computing or mobile edge computing, yes, if you like. That is a very complicated infrastructure problem, isn't it, in terms of where do these edge appliances live?
Well, it depends how you approach it, and one also has to see, when one's talking about latency, the overall network configuration is very important, and one has to say there is no one solution there. If you look at the network, the architecture from different operators, they can be very different, and indeed very much not just from one operator to another, but from one region to another. Do I have dark fibre there? Is it sitting there? Is it free to use, almost as we have in some Asian countries, which obviously brings, in terms of latency, a huge advantage. But you are right that very small latencies are sort of things we're talking about for smart highways. We really need to bring not just the latency, but the ability to actually use the information, the compute, the memory, closer to the user or whatever's using that. And that does mean things like mobile edge computing. And you could see that, oh, that's adding a layer of complexity. But in actual fact, if you have the right platform, if you think of cloud computing today, the sort of Google way of doing things, in some ways that makes a very complex system in terms of number of entities, but the fundamental operations are very simple. And the ability to actually put the data centers pretty much anywhere you like I'll create a new one here. And because the platform is flexible enough, that becomes relatively easy. And if you had the same sort of paradigm in our telecoms network, and mobile edge computing does have this idea that the mobile edge computing doesn't have to be at a particular node, it can be at various different nodes. And that ability to put it at various different levels of the hierarchy within the overall architecture, that brings a certain simplification. It means that we have one set of APIs, exactly the same as with your Google Cloud. You have one set of APIs which you need to write the applications to, and then the actual control of where that is, that will then be coming through the orchestration. And that's all part of the promise of 5G, this ability to try and tie these ideas together. So a lot of the ideas, there are implementations within LTE, but this ability to really be service-driven, to have an architecture that is flexible and allowing to pick the right location for the intelligence and the resources I need. This is more, I think, a 5G area, and this true virtualization from end to end, I think this is more a 5G-IA idea that we need to realize.
Well, and I'd also like to ask you, because I think you'll have a great perspective on this. As it relates to 5G, there's this sort of hype cycle, which operator is going to be first, which country is going to be first. In the EU, you have dozens and dozens of operators that are at very advanced stages in trialing 5G, and then on the regulatory side, some governments are a little more proactive in making the necessary spectrum available for testing and for deployment. Based on everything that you've observed in your conversations with your members and other stakeholders, where do you foresee 5G being commercialized first in Europe? And why?
I think in Europe we will see quite a broad commercialization, but I don't think Europe will be the first to deploy. And the places I'm expecting to be first will be US and certain Asian markets. I think will have the first 5G out there. Of course, the question is, what will they actually deploy? And we're at a stage where we have the first stable standards from 3GPP for non-standalone. So in other words, only 5G based on LTE. So not as a standalone technology as itself, but a sort of addition to LTE. I always call this LTE with new shoes. It does provide some abilities, but it's not the promise of 5G we were talking about 30 seconds ago. It's not a completely new architecture which allows us to get beyond the current paradigm of user, operator, vendor. It's not something which is going to change the world necessarily. And I have the feeling that maybe Europe is slightly more focused on this, shall we say, full 5G, or this 5G which is actually looking in all the various corners, looking more at the verticals. So looking at the latency, looking at the massive IoT. And possibly due to the sort of economic cycles, obviously you go through the various generations of mobile communication technology. And there is a time when you invest, there's heavy investment in that technology, and then there is a time where you try and regain revenue from that investment. And I have the feeling those sort of investment cycles are a little bit out of step between Europe and Asia and North America. And that means, I think for Europe, the actual deployment of 5G may come a little bit later than the other locations. But I think the actual 5G that will be deployed will typically be a broader, fuller 5G, which might provide a better platform for innovation, though that we will have to see. I don't see at the moment huge difference, or shall we say, I wouldn't care to pick out particular countries where that will happen. There are a number of governments with strong programs trying to enhance the 5G deployment in Europe. And indeed the European Commission is pushing quite heavily, trying to find the unified spectrum, unified regulation. Clearly when you have 27 or 28 different countries all next to each other, there are a large number of issues with coordination and things like that. Now, these cause problems to some extent. To get a common view across 27 or 28 countries is not easy. On the other hand, it also provides some sort of potential in so much as it will force Europe to solve some of the problems which will be needed to be solved across the world. Things like when I have a country border, how do I handle things like, for example, automated driving? How do I make sure that the cars don't all crash on the border? And these problems will perhaps slow down Europe to start with, but will provide solutions which the world will need.
Spectral harmonization is probably a topic best left for another day, but I do think you make a very good point about taking this pragmatic approach and waiting for the standalone 5G new radio specification and the equipment to get out there. To give an example, Verizon's deploying fixed wireless 5G. The first round's based on their own Verizon Technical Forum standard. They're going to put that in the field, and they're going to rip it out, replace it with non-standalone 5G-NR equipment. Then they're going to rip that out and replace it with standalone 5G equipment. If you want to be first to market, that's a great way to do it. But if you really want to, as you said, take this comprehensive view of everything that 5G is, I think it's safer to let the technology develop.
There's always pluses and minuses on either of those approaches. But clearly, if your goal is really to create that innovation ecosystem, then that innovation ecosystem needs to be based on mature or at least stable interfaces. If you're asking someone to develop software, basically, which is running on these networks, if you can't define what services, what APIs are available, then for these typical small startup companies, it's very unattractive. You say, well, develop it for this. Of course, next week it'll be completely different, the platform you're doing. So it's not that you can't learn things, but I think the true potential is trying to get some stability and some common platform where I develop once and deploy globally. Things that we see in things like the Apple ecosystem and things like that, which is very successful. I also ought to mention Android if I mention Apple, just to be balanced. But we can see in those situations that the ability to have a defined environment and APIs and services is a very compelling one if you want an innovation environment.
Well, Colin, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective and to keep us up to date on the important work that 5G